When the first shots were fired in what would become the Six-Day War, the Middle East was already carrying the weight of unfinished history. It was a region where borders were not merely lines on maps, but living reminders of conflict, displacement, and competing visions of nationhood. Every city, every frontier outpost, and every stretch of contested land seemed to hold within it the memory of earlier struggles that had never truly been resolved. By the mid-1960s, the atmosphere across this landscape had taken on a tense, almost irreversible quality. The sense of stability was fragile, maintained less by trust between states and more by the absence of full-scale war. Beneath that fragile surface, however, lay a network of escalating fears, hardened political positions, and military preparations that steadily pulled the region toward confrontation. In the years following the upheaval of 1948, when the creation of Israel and the displacement of large Palestinian populations reshaped the political geography of the region, a lasting state of tension had taken root. Armistice agreements had replaced open warfare, but they had not produced peace. Instead, they froze a conflict that continued to evolve in new forms. Through border skirmishes, political rhetoric, and competing national narratives that left little room for compromise, Israel emerged from its early decades as a state defined by both survival and vigilance. Surrounded by neighboring countries that largely rejected its legitimacy, it developed a national posture centered on rapid mobilization and military readiness. Its leadership viewed security not as a policy choice, but as a condition of existence. This perception shaped every aspect of its strategic thinking, from border defense to intelligence operations, and it contributed to an environment where even minor incidents carried the potential for escalation. On the other side of the frontier, Arab states such as Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were navigating their own internal and external pressures. The rise of Arab nationalism, particularly under the leadership of Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser, introduced a powerful ideological current into regional politics. His vision of Arab unity and resistance against perceived external domination resonated deeply across the region. But it also intensified expectations and raised the stakes of political confrontation. Along the borders themselves, the situation was becoming increasingly unstable. The demarcation lines established after earlier conflicts were frequently violated by patrols, infiltrators, and military responses. The Jordan River Valley became a particular flashpoint, where disputes over water resources and agricultural development added another layer of tension to an already fragile equilibrium. Exchanges of fire between Israeli forces and Syrian positions overlooking the valley became more frequent, each incident reinforcing the belief on both sides that escalation was inevitable. Diplomatic efforts to stabilize the region struggled to keep pace with events on the ground. International actors, including the United Nations, attempted to maintain ceasefire arrangements and buffer zones. But these mechanisms often proved insufficient against the intensity of local and regional rivalries. Intelligence assessments circulated among governments that increasingly portrayed the situation in stark, binary terms. Either deterrence would hold or war would erupt. By 1967, the psychological landscape of the region had shifted in subtle but decisive ways. Leaders no longer spoke primarily of avoiding conflict, but of preparing for it. Military planning assumed that any confrontation would be short, decisive, and regional in scope. This belief, shared in different forms by multiple actors, created a dangerous convergence of expectations. Each side anticipated that if war came, it would be able to endure it quickly and decisively. Yet beneath these calculations lay uncertainty. No leadership fully understood the intentions or thresholds of its adversaries. Misinterpretation became a defining feature of the period, as signals intended as deterrence were often read as preparation for aggression. Mobilizations intended as defensive measures were interpreted as offensive positioning. In this environment, the space for diplomatic correction steadily narrowed. The crisis did not erupt from a single cause, nor did it follow a linear path. Instead, it accumulated through a series of interconnected developments: military deployments, political declarations, intelligence reports, and border incidents that reinforced one another until the overall system became unstable. Each actor responded to perceived threats in ways that unintentionally increased the sense of threat felt by others. As the spring of 1967 progressed, the region entered a phase in which events began to accelerate beyond the capacity of diplomacy to contain them. Decisions made in capital cities echoed almost immediately along contested borders. Military movements triggered counter-movements. Political statements reverberated through already heightened public sentiment. The distinction between preparation and provocation blurred. It was within this compressed and volatile environment that the foundations of the Six-Day War were laid. What followed would not be a prolonged campaign of attrition, but a sudden and dramatic conflict that unfolded with extraordinary speed. In less than a week, the balance of power in the Middle East would be fundamentally altered, redrawing territorial lines and reshaping political realities that had seemed entrenched for decades. Yet, at this stage, none of that outcome was visible with certainty. The region stood instead at a threshold between uneasy stability and open war, where every decision carried disproportionate weight. The coming days would reveal how quickly that threshold could be crossed, and how profoundly the consequences would reshape the history of the region. To understand how the Middle East reached the brink of war in 1967, it was necessary to look back to the formative rupture that reshaped the region in 1948. The conflict that accompanied the creation of Israel did not end with armistice agreements. It instead marked the beginning of a prolonged and evolving confrontation that would define regional politics for decades. The events of that year became a foundational reference point for nearly every political argument, military doctrine, and diplomatic calculation that followed. When the 1948 Arab-Israeli War concluded, it left behind not a settled peace, but a fractured landscape. Armistice lines were drawn in place of internationally recognized borders, producing a map defined by provisional arrangements rather than final resolution. These lines separated Israeli-controlled territory from neighboring Arab states, but they did not resolve the deeper disputes over legitimacy, sovereignty, and displacement that had fueled the conflict in the first place. For many Palestinians, the aftermath of the war became known as the Nakba, or catastrophe, a period in which hundreds of thousands were displaced from their homes and villages. Refugee populations spread across neighboring territories, particularly into Jordan, Lebanon, and the Gaza Strip, where camps gradually transformed into semi-permanent settlements. The presence of these displaced communities became both a humanitarian issue and a political catalyst, sustaining demands for return or restitution that remained unresolved. Israel, meanwhile, emerged from the war as a newly established state still in the process of consolidating its identity and security. Its early leadership faced the dual challenge of absorbing large numbers of immigrants while simultaneously preparing for the possibility of renewed conflict. Military service became a central institution, and national defense strategy was built around the assumption that future wars could be both imminent and existential in nature. The armistice agreements that ended the 1948 fighting created multiple ceasefire lines with neighboring states. But these arrangements were inherently unstable. Along Israel's borders with Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, the lack of formal peace meant that military tensions persisted beneath a thin layer of diplomatic containment. Each frontier developed its own localized dynamics of conflict, often involving infiltration, raids, and retaliatory strikes. In the years that followed, these border tensions gradually intensified. Armed groups operating from Arab territories conducted cross-border incursions into Israel, often targeting civilian settlements or infrastructure. In response, Israeli forces carried out retaliatory operations that extended beyond immediate border areas, sometimes deep into neighboring states. This cycle of action and response contributed to a growing sense of insecurity on all sides, reinforcing narratives of threat and vulnerability. Among the most persistent and volatile arenas of conflict was the frontier between Israel and Syria. The demilitarized zones established after 1948 became points of contention, particularly around agricultural land and water resources. The Jordan River and its tributaries, essential for irrigation and survival in the arid region, became central to strategic planning. Competing water diversion projects heightened tensions further, as both sides viewed control of water flow as a matter of national security. By the early 1960s, Syria had undergone significant political transformation, including periods of instability and military coups. These internal shifts influenced its foreign policy posture, particularly toward Israel, where ideological hostility combined with strategic concerns over border security. Artillery exchanges along the frontier became increasingly frequent, and the situation gradually evolved into a sustained low-intensity conflict. Egypt, under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, played a different but equally influential role in shaping the regional environment. Nasser's rise to prominence in the 1950s, particularly after the 1952 revolution and the Suez Crisis of 1956, positioned him as a central figure in Arab nationalism. His vision of pan-Arab unity and resistance to Western influence resonated widely across the region, elevating Egypt's political influence beyond its borders. The Suez Crisis itself became a defining moment in regional consciousness. Egypt's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal in 1956 led to a military intervention by Israel, the United Kingdom, and France. Although Egypt ultimately retained control of the canal following international pressure, the crisis enhanced Nasser's stature as a symbol of Arab defiance. It also deepened mistrust between Egypt and Israel, reinforcing the perception that future confrontations were likely. In the aftermath of Suez, a United Nations peacekeeping force was stationed in the Sinai Peninsula to monitor the border between Egypt and Israel. This arrangement temporarily stabilized the situation, creating a buffer zone that reduced direct military contact. However, the underlying tensions remained unresolved, and the presence of peacekeepers was always contingent on the consent of the host state. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, Arab nationalism continued to gain momentum. The idea of Arab unity, though never fully realized in political terms, became a powerful ideological force. It influenced domestic politics across multiple states and shaped foreign policy decisions in ways that often prioritized regional solidarity over bilateral compromise. At the same time, the Cold War began to exert increasing influence on Middle Eastern affairs. The United States and the Soviet Union each sought to expand their strategic presence in the region, providing military aid, economic assistance, and political support to different actors. Egypt, in particular, developed closer ties with the Soviet Union, which supplied military equipment and training. Israel, by contrast, cultivated strong relations with Western powers, especially the United States and France. These external alignments added a global dimension to regional tensions. Military capabilities across the Middle East expanded significantly during this period, with air forces, armored divisions, and missile systems becoming central components of national defense strategies. The increasing sophistication of military technology raised both the stakes and the potential speed of any future conflict. By the mid-1960s, the pattern of border clashes, political rhetoric, and military buildup had become deeply entrenched. No single incident defined the trajectory of escalation. Rather, it was the accumulation of many smaller confrontations that gradually narrowed the space for diplomatic resolution. Each side interpreted the actions of the other through a lens shaped by past experiences, often assuming hostile intent even in ambiguous situations. In this environment, deterrence became a central concept in military planning. Both Arab states and Israel sought to project strength in order to discourage attack. Yet this very process contributed to increased instability. Demonstrations of military readiness were often interpreted as preparations for offensive action, creating a feedback loop of suspicion and escalation. By 1966, the region was no longer simply characterized by tension. It was defined by a structured pattern of confrontation that had become self-reinforcing. Diplomatic channels remained open, but they were increasingly overshadowed by military considerations. Leaders on all sides understood that the existing status quo was fragile, yet none could identify a viable path toward lasting resolution. The stage was now set for a crisis in which a single sequence of events could transform chronic tension into open war. By the mid-1960s, the Middle East was no longer drifting toward conflict in a vague or distant sense. It was moving toward it with accumulating force, as though each political decision and border incident was tightening an already strained mechanism. Between 1966 and the spring of 1967, the region passed through a sequence of escalations that transformed chronic instability into an imminent crisis. What had once been a pattern of localized clashes and rhetorical confrontation began to converge into a single, regional confrontation that no actor could easily contain. The most volatile front during this period remained the Syrian-Israeli border. In 1966, clashes intensified significantly in the demilitarized zones separating the two states. These areas, originally intended as buffers after the 1948 armistice, had become contested landscapes where agricultural settlement, military patrols, and political symbolism overlapped. Israeli and Syrian forces increasingly exchanged fire over disputed land use and security concerns, while local incidents escalated rapidly into artillery duels. One of the most consequential developments during this period was the growing influence of Syrian internal politics on its military posture. Political instability in Damascus, marked by coups and shifts in ideological leadership, contributed to an increasingly confrontational stance toward Israel. The Syrian government positioned itself as a frontline state of Arab resistance, and border engagements were often framed domestically as proof of national resolve. This dynamic encouraged a more aggressive posture along the frontier, where small-scale incidents could escalate without clear central restraint. Israel, for its part, responded to these border tensions with a doctrine of rapid retaliation. Military planners believed that decisive and overwhelming responses to cross-border attacks were necessary to deter future incursions. As a result, Israeli forces conducted operations that often extended beyond the immediate point of contact, targeting Syrian positions and infrastructure. These retaliatory strikes, while intended to restore deterrence, frequently deepened hostility and reinforced Syrian perceptions of existential threat. By late 1966, the cycle of action and response along the northern frontier had become increasingly difficult to control. Each exchange of fire generated political pressure for stronger responses, and each response generated further escalation. The situation gradually evolved from intermittent clashes into a sustained pattern of low-intensity warfare. Meanwhile, broader regional dynamics were shifting in ways that added further instability. Egypt, under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, remained the most influential Arab state and a central actor in regional politics. Nasser's vision of Arab unity and resistance to external influence continued to shape political discourse across the region, even as practical cooperation among Arab states remained uneven. In early 1967, tensions between Syria and Israel reached a new peak, following a series of border incidents that included aerial engagements. Israeli aircraft and Syrian air defenses exchanged fire over contested areas, marking one of the first significant air confrontations between the two states. The escalation of aerial combat introduced a new and more dangerous dimension to the conflict, as it expanded the potential scope and speed of future engagements. These developments placed increasing pressure on Egypt to respond politically and strategically. Although Egypt was not directly involved in the Syrian-Israeli clashes at this stage, its role as a leading Arab power meant that expectations of solidarity were high. Domestic and regional political dynamics made neutrality difficult to sustain, particularly as Syrian leadership called for greater Arab coordination against Israel. At the same time, intelligence assessments circulating within regional capitals began to reflect growing uncertainty. Reports of military buildups, possible mobilizations, and shifting alliances contributed to an atmosphere in which worst-case assumptions increasingly shaped decision-making. Leaders interpreted incomplete or ambiguous information through the lens of existing fears, often assuming that adversaries were preparing for imminent action. The situation reached a critical turning point in May 1967. In a series of escalating diplomatic and military steps, Egypt began to reposition itself more directly within the unfolding crisis. Egyptian forces moved into the Sinai Peninsula in significant numbers, a development that altered the strategic balance along the southern front. This movement was closely monitored by Israeli intelligence and interpreted as a significant shift in Egypt's posture. Shortly afterward, Egypt requested the withdrawal of United Nations peacekeeping forces stationed in the Sinai since the aftermath of the Suez Crisis. These forces had long served as a buffer between Egyptian and Israeli military positions, helping to reduce direct contact along the border. Their removal eliminated a key stabilizing presence in the region and increased the likelihood of direct confrontation. The decision to withdraw the peacekeeping forces was followed by further strategic moves that intensified the crisis. Egyptian control over the Straits of Tiran, a crucial maritime passage for Israeli shipping, became a central point of contention. Restrictions on passage were interpreted in Israel as a direct threat to economic and strategic interests, particularly given the importance of access to southern ports. These developments had immediate psychological and political effects across the region. In Israel, the combination of military mobilization in Sinai and restrictions on maritime access reinforced perceptions that a coordinated Arab action was becoming possible. Public discourse and political debate increasingly reflected concern over national survival and the possibility of multi-front war. In Arab capitals, the same events were often interpreted through a different lens. Egyptian and Syrian leadership framed their actions as assertions of sovereignty and responses to perceived Israeli aggression. Public statements emphasized resistance and regional solidarity, further raising expectations of confrontation. The language of diplomacy gave way increasingly to the language of resolve and deterrence. As May progressed, military preparations accelerated on all sides. Reserve forces were mobilized, units repositioned, and strategic planning intensified. The distinction between defensive preparation and offensive readiness became increasingly blurred, as each side sought to ensure it would not be caught unprepared in the event of war. Despite ongoing diplomatic activity, the space for de-escalation narrowed significantly. International actors attempted to mediate and reduce tensions, but the rapid pace of developments on the ground outstripped these efforts. Communication between leaders was often filtered through layers of mistrust, and proposals for compromise were frequently rejected or delayed. By the end of May 1967, the region stood at a point of extreme fragility. Military forces were positioned in readiness across multiple fronts. Political rhetoric had reached a level of intensity that left little room for retreat without loss of credibility. Intelligence assessments on all sides suggested that war, if it came, would likely be swift and decisive. Yet even at this stage, the precise moment of escalation remained uncertain. No single actor had made a final, irrevocable decision for full-scale war. But the cumulative effect of events had created conditions in which a small trigger could rapidly ignite a broader conflict. The system had become highly sensitive to disruption, and the margin for error had all but disappeared. Within days, that disruption would arrive. By late May 1967, the Middle East had entered a phase in which the machinery of war was not only in motion, but beginning to reshape how leaders, soldiers, and civilians perceived reality itself. The situation was no longer defined solely by troop movements or diplomatic exchanges. It was increasingly governed by psychology, by fear, expectation, miscalculation, and the accelerating logic of anticipation. In this environment, decisions were made not only on what was known, but on what was feared might be coming next. The region had become a landscape of mirror perceptions. Every military action taken by one side was interpreted through the assumption that it concealed deeper intent. A defensive mobilization was read as preparation for offense. A diplomatic warning was seen as a prelude to attack. Even silence carried meaning, often interpreted as concealment or deception. The result was a system in which uncertainty itself became destabilizing, because no actor could confidently interpret the intentions of any other. In Israel, the sense of strategic vulnerability intensified sharply. The concentration of Egyptian forces in Sinai, combined with the removal of United Nations buffer forces, created an atmosphere in which the southern frontier felt suddenly exposed. Military intelligence assessments, while varied in their conclusions, consistently highlighted the possibility of coordinated action involving multiple Arab states. Even when definitive evidence was lacking, the possibility alone carried significant weight in strategic planning. This perception was reinforced by Israel's historical experience of surprise and encirclement during earlier conflicts. The national military doctrine, shaped by those experiences, emphasized the danger of waiting too long to act once mobilization by adversaries was detected. Within this framework, time itself became a strategic resource, one that could be lost irreversibly if adversaries were allowed to complete their preparations. At the same time, Israeli leadership faced internal pressures shaped by public anxiety and political responsibility. The visible mobilization of reserves and the disruption of civilian life created a domestic environment in which expectations of decisive government action grew steadily stronger. The leadership's challenge was not only to interpret external threats, but also to maintain public confidence under conditions of uncertainty. Across the border, Egyptian leadership was operating under its own complex set of pressures and perceptions. The movement of forces into Sinai was framed as a demonstration of sovereignty and deterrence, but it also carried the burden of regional expectations. As the leading voice of Arab nationalism, Egypt was expected to respond to perceived Israeli threats in ways that affirmed Arab unity and strength. Any perception of hesitation risked undermining that role. Within this context, military signaling became as important as military capability. Public speeches, radio broadcasts, and diplomatic statements took on heightened significance, as they were interpreted not merely as communication, but as strategic positioning. Language became an instrument of statecraft, with phrases of resolve and resistance circulating widely across the region. Yet beneath the surface of public rhetoric, uncertainty remained profound. Intelligence services across the region were operating with incomplete information, often relying on fragmented reports and contested interpretations. Movements of troops, aircraft, and naval units were tracked closely, but their meaning was often unclear. Whether these movements indicated preparation for imminent attack or simply defensive posture was a question that could not be resolved with confidence. This ambiguity created a dangerous feedback loop. Because intentions were unclear, each side prepared for the worst-case scenario. The other side interpreted those preparations as confirmation of hostile intent. In this way, defensive logic gradually produced offensive expectations, even in the absence of explicit decisions for war. The psychological dimension of the crisis extended beyond military and political leadership into broader society. Public discourse in multiple countries became increasingly charged, with newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public speeches reflecting a growing sense of inevitability. The idea that war might be avoidable began to recede, replaced by discussions of timing, preparedness, and outcome. Military planners on all sides began to operate under the assumption that if war were to occur, it would be short and decisive. This assumption shaped operational planning in ways that emphasized speed, surprise, and concentration of force. The belief that rapid victory was possible reduced the perceived risks of escalation, while also increasing the incentive to strike first if war seemed imminent. This convergence of strategic thinking created a particularly unstable environment. When multiple actors believe that a rapid and decisive outcome is possible, the threshold for initiating conflict can become lower, especially if delay is perceived as disadvantageous. In such conditions, deterrence and provocation become difficult to distinguish from one another. International observers attempted to interpret the situation, but their assessments often reflected the same uncertainties that affected regional actors. Diplomatic communications sought to reduce tensions, yet they struggled to keep pace with rapidly evolving military realities. The gap between diplomatic language and operational planning widened steadily. By early June, the sense of impending crisis had become nearly universal among informed observers, even if the exact form of that crisis remained unclear. The region felt suspended in a narrow window of time, in which a single decision, misinterpretation, or encounter could trigger large-scale conflict. Yet because no actor could be certain of the intentions of others, delay itself carried risk. In this tense atmosphere, strategic patience became increasingly difficult to sustain. Leaders faced a narrowing set of options, each carrying significant uncertainty. To act risked escalation. To wait risked vulnerability. The balance between these risks shifted rapidly as intelligence reports, military mobilizations, and political pressures accumulated. What emerged was not a planned descent into war, but a convergence of perceptions that made war increasingly difficult to avoid. Each side believed it was responding defensively to the actions of others, yet the cumulative effect of those responses was to create the conditions for a rapid and widespread outbreak of hostilities. By the end of this psychological and strategic buildup, the region had reached a point where the distinction between anticipation and initiation had almost disappeared. The stage was set for a conflict that would unfold with extraordinary speed once the first decisive action was taken. The morning of June 5th, 1967, did not begin with the clarity of inevitability, but with the dense uncertainty that had come to define the preceding days. Across the region, military units were already on heightened alert. Aircraft were positioned on runways, and armored divisions stood ready in staging areas that had been prepared in anticipation of an unknown trigger. The atmosphere was one of suspended motion, an entire region waiting for a signal that no one could precisely predict, but many believed was approaching. In Israel, the leadership had reached a point where delay itself was increasingly viewed as a strategic risk. Intelligence reports indicated that Egyptian air forces were dispersed across multiple bases in Sinai and the Nile Delta. At the same time, the continued presence of Arab forces in forward positions, combined with the closure of critical maritime routes and the withdrawal of international buffer forces, created a perception of narrowing strategic space. The possibility that coordinated Arab action could be launched first was a central concern in military planning. After intense internal deliberation, Israel initiated what would become the defining action of the early war. A large-scale preemptive air operation designed to neutralize opposing air forces before they could be fully mobilized. The objective was not gradual attrition, but immediate disruption, targeting aircraft on the ground, command infrastructure, and airfields in a coordinated and concentrated strike. As dawn broke, Israeli aircraft began to move in carefully timed formations toward Egyptian air bases. The operation relied heavily on surprise, precision, and the calculated timing of attack waves designed to coincide with vulnerable periods of ground readiness. Radar detection systems in the region, while active, did not immediately translate the incoming aircraft movements into a full-scale offensive interpretation, in part due to the ambiguity of early signals and the expectation that any escalation might still be delayed. When the first waves of Israeli aircraft reached Egyptian airspace, the transition from tension to war occurred with abrupt intensity. Airfields across the Sinai and deeper within Egyptian territory came under sustained attack. Runways were struck to prevent takeoff. Aircraft parked in open formations were destroyed on the ground, and command and control facilities were targeted to disrupt coordination. The speed and coordination of the assault created immediate operational confusion within Egyptian air defense structures. Within a short span of time, the Egyptian Air Force suffered catastrophic losses in both aircraft and operational readiness. Many of its combat aircraft were destroyed before they could be launched, while others were forced into emergency response under conditions of limited coordination. The intended function of air power, to project control over the battlefield, was rapidly compromised by the destruction of its infrastructure on the ground. The psychological effect of the strike was as significant as its material impact. Military commanders across the region were confronted with rapidly unfolding information indicating that one of the central pillars of Egyptian defense capability had been severely degraded within hours. Communications networks struggled to maintain coherence as reports of damage and disruption spread through command structures. For Israel, the success of the opening air operation fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the conflict's early phase. Air superiority, long regarded as a critical factor in regional warfare, shifted decisively. This shift enabled greater freedom of movement for ground and armored forces. while simultaneously limiting the ability of opposing forces to coordinate or reinforce positions effectively. On the ground, Egyptian units in Sinai faced immediate challenges in responding to the scale and speed of the attack. Forward positions, already stretched across a wide front, had to contend with disrupted communications and uncertainty regarding the status of air support. The fragmentation of command information contributed to delays in coordinated response, as units attempted to interpret evolving and often incomplete reports from higher headquarters. In the broader Arab world, initial reports of the strike were met with shock and confusion. The scale of damage to Egyptian air capabilities was not immediately clear, but it became increasingly evident that the opening phase of the conflict had resulted in a significant strategic setback. This realization introduced a new and urgent dimension to decision-making among Arab leadership, as the assumption of parity or balance in the early stages of conflict was quickly undermined. International observers, meanwhile, struggled to assess the full implications of the opening strike in real time. Diplomatic channels were activated almost immediately, but communication lagged behind the speed of military developments. Early calls for restraint and ceasefire were issued, yet the situation on the ground was already evolving beyond the initial phase. As the day progressed, it became clear that the opening air operation had not only initiated the war, but had also shaped its early trajectory in decisive ways. The destruction of air assets altered the balance of mobility, reconnaissance, and support across multiple fronts. Ground operations, which would follow in subsequent phases, were now unfolding in an environment where air dominance played a central role. Yet even as the material consequences of the strike became evident, the psychological dimension continued to expand. Leaders on all sides were now confronted with the reality that the conflict had moved beyond the threshold of anticipation and into active warfare. Decisions that had previously been framed in terms of prevention or deterrence were now being made under conditions of ongoing combat. The opening strike of June 5th did not resolve the conflict. Rather, it accelerated it. In a matter of hours, the strategic assumptions that had shaped months of preparation were overturned. What remained was a rapidly evolving battlefield in which momentum, adaptation, and response would determine the course of the days to follow. With the opening airstrikes on June 5th having dramatically altered the balance of the battlefield, the war's southern front rapidly shifted into its most expansive and strategically decisive land campaign. The Sinai Peninsula, stretching between the Suez Canal and the Negev Desert, became the central arena in which armored warfare, operational speed, and command disruption would determine the trajectory of the conflict between Israel and Egypt. Almost immediately after air superiority was achieved, Israeli ground forces began to mobilize for a large-scale advance into Sinai. The operational objective was not merely to repel Egyptian forces, but to dismantle their forward deployment structure before it could reorganize under the shock of the initial air assault. Armored divisions, supported by mechanized infantry and engineering units, moved across multiple axes toward key Egyptian positions. Egyptian forces in Sinai had been deployed in a forward posture prior to the outbreak of hostilities. This deployment, shaped by both strategic expectation and political signaling, placed significant numbers of troops closer to the Israeli frontier. However, the speed and intensity of the air campaign severely disrupted their ability to coordinate a unified defensive response. Communications lines were degraded, air support was largely unavailable, and logistical networks were thrown into disarray. As Israeli armored columns advanced, the Egyptian command structure struggled to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Orders issued from higher command levels often failed to reach frontline units in time. and in many cases, local commanders were forced to make decisions based on incomplete or outdated information. The result was a fragmented defensive response that varied significantly across different sectors of the front. One of the earliest and most significant engagements of the ground campaign occurred around the northern approaches of Sinai, where Israeli forces encountered fortified Egyptian positions designed to delay or absorb an advance. These defensive sites, while structurally robust, had been designed under assumptions of coordinated air and artillery support that were no longer fully available. As Israeli forces applied concentrated pressure, these positions began to collapse in a series of rapid breakthroughs. Further south, additional Israeli units pushed toward key logistical and communication hubs. The objective in these areas was not only territorial gain, but the disruption of Egyptian operational coherence. Supply routes, command centers, and junction points became focal targets in a campaign that prioritized speed and dislocation over prolonged engagement. At Rafah and El Arish, some of the most intense early ground fighting in Sinai unfolded. Egyptian units attempted to establish defensive lines, but these efforts were repeatedly undermined by the lack of coordinated air cover and the difficulty of maintaining communication under sustained pressure. Israeli armored units, benefiting from mobility and momentum, exploited gaps in defensive formations to advance rapidly through contested areas. As the campaign progressed, the nature of the Egyptian withdrawal became increasingly disorganized in certain sectors. In some cases, units retreated in good order, attempting to regroup at secondary defensive lines. In others, the speed of the Israeli advance and the breakdown of communication led to fragmented movements that further complicated command control. The cumulative effect was a gradual erosion of coherent defensive structure across much of the peninsula. The Battle of Abu Agela became one of the key engagements in the central Sinai Front. This fortified position, considered an important defensive node, was subjected to a combined arms operation involving infantry, armor, and engineering units. Through coordinated maneuver and sustained pressure, Israeli forces succeeded in overcoming the defensive network, opening a critical corridor for further advance into the interior of Sinai. As Egyptian positions continued to deteriorate, the broader strategic implications of the campaign began to emerge. The loss of forward defensive infrastructure in Sinai meant that the depth of Egypt's defensive strategy was being compressed in real time. What had been intended as a layered defense-in-depth structure was being dismantled in rapid succession, forcing a continuous reassessment of defensive priorities. Throughout the campaign, Egyptian leadership faced the challenge of responding to a rapidly evolving battlefield while simultaneously managing broader political and strategic considerations. Reports of battlefield losses, combined with the scale of the Israeli advance, created increasing pressure to stabilize the front and prevent further territorial penetration. However, the speed of events limited the effectiveness of reorganizational efforts. Israeli forces, for their part, maintained a consistent operational emphasis on momentum. The underlying strategic logic of the Sinai Campaign depended on preventing Egyptian forces from re-establishing coherent defensive lines. This required sustained pressure across multiple axes, ensuring that withdrawal or regrouping could not translate into effective resistance. As Israeli units advanced deeper into Sinai, the geographical scale of the campaign expanded significantly. Desert terrain, long supply lines, and logistical demands introduced operational challenges that required careful coordination. Yet these challenges were mitigated in part by the disrupted state of Egyptian defenses, which limited the likelihood of sustained counteroffensives. By the second and third days of ground operations, the cumulative effect of air superiority armored mobility and fragmented opposition had produced a decisive shift in control across much of the peninsula. Egyptian forces, while still present in significant numbers, were increasingly unable to mount coordinated large-scale resistance. International diplomatic efforts intensified as reports of the rapid Israeli advance spread beyond the region. Calls for ceasefire became more urgent, reflecting growing concern over the speed and scale of territorial changes underway. However, these diplomatic interventions struggled to influence the operational tempo of the campaign, which continued to unfold rapidly on the ground. By the time the Sinai Campaign reached its later stages, the strategic outcome of the Southern Front had largely been determined. Israeli forces had achieved significant territorial penetration, and Egyptian military capacity in the region had been substantially degraded. The peninsula, once a forward defensive buffer, was now effectively under Israeli control in most operational sectors. Yet even as the campaign in Sinai moved toward conclusion, the broader war was far from over. Attention was already shifting to other fronts, where new battles were unfolding and where the conflict would take on different geographic and symbolic dimensions. While the Sinai Campaign unfolded with rapid armored movement and desert warfare, the central front of the conflict carried a different weight, one shaped not only by military objectives, but by geography, dense with history, symbolism, and political consequence. As Israeli forces pressed their advantage in the south, attention turned eastward toward the front controlled by Jordan, where the war would take on a far more intimate and urban character. Jordan had entered the conflict in the earliest hours of June 5th, acting in coordination with broader Arab military expectations and responding to reports of Egyptian engagement. The decision placed the Jordanian Front immediately into active combat, transforming the line of contact along the armistice boundary into a zone of sustained artillery exchanges and ground operations. Unlike the expansive desert battles of Sinai, this front was defined by proximity. Cities, hills, and fortified positions separated by only short distances. At the heart of the Jordanian theater lay Jerusalem, a city whose significance extended far beyond its military value. Divided since 1948, it existed as two distinct urban realities, separated by fortified lines and checkpoints. West Jerusalem was under Israeli control, while East Jerusalem, including the Old City, was held by Jordanian forces. The dividing line between them was not only strategic, but deeply symbolic, representing one of the most emotionally charged borders in the region. As fighting intensified, artillery exchanges between Israeli and Jordanian forces began to impact urban areas across the city's divided landscape. Elevated positions in East Jerusalem allowed Jordanian artillery units to target Israeli-held neighborhoods, while Israeli forces responded with counter-battery fire aimed at suppressing these positions. The result was a rapidly escalating urban battlefield, where civilian areas and military objectives were often unavoidably intertwined. Israeli leadership, recognizing the strategic and symbolic importance of Jerusalem, directed military operations toward securing control over key points in and around the city. The objective was not only to neutralize artillery positions, but also to establish control over critical access routes and elevated terrain that dominated the surrounding area. These efforts gradually shifted the tactical balance in favor of Israeli forces, though the fighting remained intense and complex. Simultaneously, operations expanded into the broader West Bank region, where Jordanian forces held a network of defensive positions across hills, valleys, and urban centers. The terrain of the West Bank played a significant role in shaping the conflict. Its elevation provided natural defensive advantages, allowing entrenched positions to oversee key routes of movement. However, once Israeli forces achieved air superiority and applied coordinated ground pressure, these advantages began to erode. Armored and infantry units advanced along multiple axes, seeking to break through Jordanian defensive lines and prevent the consolidation of organized resistance. In several locations, Jordanian forces mounted determined defensive actions, attempting to delay the advance and preserve control over strategic terrain. Yet, communication difficulties and the broader strain of multi-front engagement limited the ability to coordinate a unified defense. As the fighting moved closer to Jerusalem itself, the character of the conflict shifted further toward urban combat. Streets, stone buildings, and narrow passageways became contested spaces where visibility was limited and engagements occurred at close range. The pace of operations slowed compared to the desert front, but the intensity of fighting remained high. One of the most significant turning points in this theater occurred as Israeli forces pushed toward East Jerusalem from multiple directions, gradually tightening the operational encirclement of the city's eastern sectors. Jordanian units, recognizing the increasing pressure, attempted to reinforce defensive positions within the urban core and along access routes. However, the cumulative effect of sustained pressure and disrupted coordination made it increasingly difficult to maintain a stable defensive perimeter. As Israeli forces advanced further into the city, the old city of Jerusalem became a focal point of military and symbolic importance. Its narrow alleys, ancient structures, and densely packed quarters created an environment unlike any other in the broader conflict. Fighting in this area was constrained by terrain and proximity, requiring careful movement and close coordination among units operating within confined spaces. The Jordanian command faced mounting challenges as the situation developed. Reports from multiple sectors indicated that defensive lines were being penetrated and that maintaining cohesive control over the eastern sectors of Jerusalem was becoming increasingly difficult. Communication delays and battlefield fragmentation compounded these challenges, making it harder to mount an organized and sustained defense. As Israeli forces continued their advance, the broader West Bank front also began to shift. Key towns and strategic positions came under pressure, and Jordanian forces increasingly focused on delaying actions rather than holding fixed lines. The operational momentum, already evident in Sinai, now extended into the central theater of the war. International attention intensified as reports of fighting in Jerusalem reached global audiences. The city's significance meant that developments there carried disproportionate diplomatic and symbolic weight. Calls for restraint and ceasefire increased in urgency, reflecting growing concern over the potential consequences of continued urban combat in such a historically and politically sensitive location. By the time organized resistance in several sectors of East Jerusalem began to weaken, the strategic situation on the Jordanian front had fundamentally changed. Israeli forces had achieved significant territorial penetration, and key urban areas were now under their control. The West Bank as a whole was experiencing a rapid transformation in military control, with organized defensive coherence giving way to localized and fragmented resistance. Yet even as the Jordanian front moved toward its decisive phase, the conflict continued to unfold elsewhere. Another theater remained active, where fighting in difficult terrain and fortified positions would add yet another dimension to a war already marked by speed, intensity, and strategic transformation. While the battles in Sinai and Jerusalem were already reshaping the map of the region, the Northern Front remained, for several days, the most tense yet comparatively static theater of the war. Along the border between Israel and Syria, artillery fire and aerial engagements had already defined years of confrontation. Yet, as the broader conflict of June 1967 expanded, this frontier would transform from a simmering line of attrition into one of the final and most difficult battlegrounds of the campaign. The terrain of the Golan Heights defined everything about the nature of the fighting that unfolded there. Rising steeply above the valleys of northern Israel, the plateau offered commanding observation over surrounding settlements and agricultural land. For years, Syrian artillery positions stationed along its ridges had been able to target Israeli villages below, creating a persistent sense of vulnerability that shaped Israeli strategic thinking in the region. Unlike the rapidly collapsing defenses seen in parts of Sinai, the Syrian positions on the Golan Heights were heavily fortified and advantageously placed. Concrete bunkers, trench systems, and interlocking fields of fire had been constructed over time, reflecting both the strategic importance Syria placed on the plateau and the expectation that it would remain a critical defensive asset in any future conflict. In the early days of the war, the Syrian-Israeli front was marked primarily by artillery exchanges and limited ground probing. Syrian forces maintained their positions along the ridge, continuing to fire into Israeli territory, while Israeli forces responded with counter-battery operations and airstrikes targeting artillery emplacements and logistical nodes. Despite the intensity of these exchanges, the front initially remained more static than those further south. This relative stability, however, masked growing pressure beneath the surface of the broader conflict. As Israeli forces achieved rapid success in Sinai and made significant advances on the Jordanian Front, strategic attention increasingly turned toward the north. The persistent threat posed by Syrian positions overlooking northern Israel, combined with the opportunity created by success on other fronts, began to shift operational priorities. By the latter part of the conflict, Israeli command began to consider a focused offensive against the Golan Heights. The decision was shaped by both military and strategic considerations. Militarily, Syrian positions continued to pose a direct threat to civilian areas below, and their fortified nature meant that leaving them intact risked prolonged instability even after hostilities elsewhere concluded. Strategically, success in Sinai and the West Bank had created operational flexibility that made a northern offensive more feasible than it had been at the war's outset. When the decision was made to initiate operations on the Syrian front, the nature of the conflict shifted once again. Unlike the desert expanses of Sinai or the urban density of Jerusalem, the Golan Heights presented a steep, fortified, and highly defensible landscape. Any advance would require coordinated movement under direct observation and fire from elevated Syrian positions. Israeli forces began their assault under conditions that combined both urgency and difficulty. The objective was to breach the Syrian defensive lines and secure control of key ridgelines that dominated the plateau. The terrain itself imposed significant constraints on movement, forcing armored units to navigate narrow approaches while infantry units engaged in uphill assaults against entrenched positions. Syrian forces, for their part, resisted strongly from fortified positions that had been designed precisely for such a scenario. The defensive network included multiple layers of resistance, with forward positions intended to delay and disrupt any advancing force before it could reach the main defensive line. Artillery support from deeper positions on the plateau added further complexity to the attacking force's advance. The early phases of the offensive were characterized by slow and difficult progress. Unlike the rapid breakthroughs seen in Sinai, the Golan Campaign required sustained engagement across rugged terrain. Visibility was limited. Communication between units was more challenging, and the defensive advantage of elevation significantly shaped the tempo of operations. As Israeli forces pushed upward, they encountered a series of heavily defended strongpoints. These positions, often embedded into the natural contours of the landscape, were designed to maximize defensive effectiveness while minimizing exposure. Fighting in these areas was intense and localized, with advances measured in small but critical gains of ground. Air support played a crucial role in the campaign, as it had in earlier phases of the war. Syrian defensive positions, though well fortified, were vulnerable to sustained aerial attack, and Israeli air operations focused on disrupting artillery positions, supply routes, and command structures. The combination of air pressure and ground maneuver gradually began to weaken the coherence of the Syrian defense. Despite this, Syrian forces continued to resist from multiple layers of defensive positions. The pace of the advance remained slower than in other theaters, reflecting both the difficulty of the terrain and the strength of the prepared defenses. However, as pressure mounted from multiple directions, gaps began to appear in the defensive structure. By the final stages of the engagement on the Golan Heights, Israeli forces had succeeded in breaching key defensive lines and advancing onto the plateau itself. Once the high ground was reached, the strategic balance shifted significantly. Control of elevated positions reduced the effectiveness of remaining Syrian defenses and allowed further advances into the interior of the plateau. As Syrian positions began to collapse under sustained pressure, the operational situation changed rapidly. Units that had held firm in earlier phases of the battle began to withdraw in some sectors, while others attempted to regroup under increasingly difficult conditions. The combination of terrain disadvantage, sustained pressure, and broader regional developments contributed to a breakdown in coordinated resistance. International diplomatic pressure intensified as the Northern Front became more active. Concerns grew over the widening scope of the conflict as fighting now extended across 3 major theaters simultaneously. Calls for a ceasefire became more urgent, reflecting the increasing recognition that the war had reached a decisive and rapidly concluding phase. By the time the main objectives on the Golan Heights were secured, the Syrian front had effectively transitioned from a contested battlefield to a zone of established control. The final major active theater of the war had been brought under Israeli military dominance, completing a rapid and sweeping transformation of the regional military map. Yet even as the fighting in the north reached its conclusion, the broader war itself was entering its final stage. Across all fronts, the pace of operations was slowing, not because of stalemate, but because the strategic outcomes were becoming increasingly clear. What had begun only days earlier as a regional crisis had now reshaped the geography and political reality of the Middle East. By June 10, 1967, the region stood at the end of an extraordinary sequence of military events that had unfolded with a speed few had anticipated, and even fewer had been prepared to absorb. What had begun only days earlier as a crisis of mounting tension had now become a completed military transformation. Across multiple fronts, organized large-scale combat was winding down, replaced by fragmented resistance, withdrawal, and the urgent work of consolidating control over newly occupied territory. The final phase of the Six-Day War did not end in a single decisive battlefield moment, but rather through a gradual convergence of ceasefire agreements, military exhaustion, and collapsing operational cohesion on several fronts. Each theater of war, Sinai, the West Bank and Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, had reached a point where continued large-scale resistance was no longer sustainable under the conditions that had developed over the preceding days. On the Egyptian front, the Sinai Campaign had effectively reached its strategic conclusion earlier in the week, as Israeli forces established control over key areas of the peninsula. Egyptian units, though still present in parts of the territory, were increasingly focused on withdrawal and regrouping rather than attempting to re-establish forward defensive lines. The rapid collapse of air support at the beginning of the war continued to shape operational limitations, leaving ground formations without the coordination necessary for large-scale counteroffensives. As the fighting subsided in Sinai, attention shifted toward consolidating positions and managing the logistics of control over vast desert territory. Armored units that had advanced rapidly in the opening days now faced the slower and more complex task of securing supply lines, establishing administrative control points, and managing captured infrastructure. The speed of the campaign had created a situation in which territorial control expanded faster than administrative systems could stabilize it. On the Jordanian Front, the situation had already been fundamentally altered by the capture of East Jerusalem and the broader advances across the West Bank. By the final days of the conflict, organized Jordanian resistance in many areas had diminished significantly, replaced by localized engagements and the withdrawal of remaining units toward the east. The urban fighting that had defined the struggle for Jerusalem had already reached its decisive phase, and control over the city's eastern sectors had been established. The old city of Jerusalem, once a focal point of intense combat, now stood under new military control. The transition from active fighting to occupation brought with it immediate and profound changes in the character of the city. Military presence replaced frontline engagement, and attention shifted from combat operations to securing key religious, cultural, and strategic sites within a densely layered urban environment. In the north, the Golan Heights campaign had reached its conclusion after difficult and sustained fighting over elevated terrain. Once Israeli forces succeeded in establishing control over key ridgelines, the remaining Syrian defensive positions began to lose coherence. By June 10th, Syrian withdrawal from major contested areas was underway, marking the effective end of organized resistance on that front. The plateau, once a heavily fortified defensive zone, had transitioned into a contested but increasingly controlled military space. As active combat diminished, the role of international diplomacy became increasingly central. Ceasefire efforts, which had been ongoing throughout the conflict, intensified in urgency as the scale of territorial change became fully apparent. Diplomatic communications moved rapidly between capitals, as global powers and regional actors sought to halt further escalation and formalize an end to hostilities. By the time ceasefire agreements were solidifying, the map of the region had been fundamentally altered. Territories that had been under Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian control prior to the war were now under Israeli military occupation. The speed of these changes, occurring within a span of only 6 days, created a geopolitical shock that reverberated far beyond the immediate battlefield. Within Israel, the end of active fighting was met with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and the immediate challenge of managing expanded territorial control. Military leadership faced the task of transitioning from rapid offensive operations to sustained administration of newly occupied regions. Civilian leadership, meanwhile, confronted the broader political implications of territorial expansion and the uncertain diplomatic consequences that would follow. Across Arab states, the end of the war was marked by shock and reassessment. The rapid loss of territory and military positions created a crisis of interpretation as well as strategy. Governments and military institutions were forced to confront not only the material consequences of defeat, but also the underlying assumptions that had shaped their expectations of the conflict's trajectory. Internationally, the war's conclusion prompted immediate calls for formal negotiations and a return to diplomatic frameworks. The scale of territorial change raised urgent questions about future borders, refugee populations, and the political status of newly occupied areas. The United Nations and major global powers moved quickly to articulate principles for ceasefire enforcement and post-war settlement. Yet even as formal hostilities came to an end, the consequences of the six-day conflict were already extending beyond the battlefield. The speed of the war's conclusion did not reduce its impact. Instead, it intensified the significance of its outcomes. Military victory and territorial change were only the beginning of a longer and more complex political and social transformation. By June 10th, the guns had largely fallen silent. But the region that emerged from those 6 days was no longer the one that had entered them. The war had ended in time, but its effects were only beginning to unfold. When the fighting of the 6-day war came to an end, the silence that followed was not the return of stability, but the beginning of a new, more complex reality. The war had lasted less than a week, yet it had redrawn borders, altered regional power balances, and set in motion political and human consequences that would extend far beyond the immediacy of the battlefield. What remained was not closure, but a transformed landscape. Military, territorial, and psychological. The most immediate and visible consequence was territorial change on a scale that reshaped the geography of the Middle East. Israel found itself in control of territories that had previously been under Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian administration. The Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights were now under Israeli military occupation. This rapid expansion created a strategic buffer in multiple directions, significantly altering Israel's defensive depth and regional posture. However, this territorial shift also introduced a new and prolonged set of administrative and political challenges. Military control over newly captured regions required the establishment of governance structures, security frameworks, and logistical systems capable of managing diverse and densely populated areas. The transition from battlefield operations to occupation introduced complexities that were not military in nature alone, but deeply political and social. For Palestinian populations in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the aftermath of the war marked another profound turning point. Many individuals found themselves under a new governing authority almost overnight, as borders and administrative control changed with little warning. Movement restrictions, military administration, and shifting legal frameworks became part of daily life. The experience of displacement, already a defining feature of the earlier 1948 conflict, took on new dimensions as populations once again faced uncertainty regarding residence, mobility, and political status. In East Jerusalem, the change in control carried additional layers of significance. The city, long divided between Jordanian and Israeli administration, was now unified under Israeli control. This transformation affected not only governance, but also the symbolic and cultural landscape of the city. Religious sites, civic institutions, and residential neighborhoods were all absorbed into a new administrative framework, creating immediate and long-term implications for its inhabitants. On the Egyptian front, the loss of the Sinai Peninsula represented a significant strategic and psychological setback. The region had served as a buffer zone and a strategic extension of Egyptian territory toward the eastern frontier. Its loss forced a rapid reassessment of military doctrine and national defense planning. The scale of the setback also carried political consequences within Egypt, where leadership faced intense pressure to interpret and respond to the outcome of the war. In Syria, the loss of the Golan Heights introduced similar strategic concerns. The plateau's elevation had long provided a defensive advantage and a forward observation position over northern Israel. Its capture by Israeli forces shifted the military balance in the region and required a re-evaluation of defensive positioning and long-term security strategy. Jordan, meanwhile, faced the consequences of territorial loss in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as the displacement of populations and the disruption of administrative control. The political and social effects within Jordan were significant, particularly given the presence of large Palestinian communities whose status and future became central issues in the aftermath of the conflict. Across the Arab world, the outcome of the war generated a profound sense of shock and reassessment. The speed and scale of the military defeat challenged existing assumptions about regional military balance and political strategy. Governments, military institutions, and political movements were compelled to reassess their positions in light of outcomes that had unfolded more rapidly and decisively than anticipated. The psychological impact of the war was as significant as its territorial consequences. In Israel, the rapid victory produced a mixture of strategic confidence and heightened responsibility. The expansion of territory brought with it questions about governance, security, and the long-term political status of newly controlled regions. The shift from existential vulnerability to territorial control introduced new strategic dilemmas that would shape policy debates for years to come. In Arab societies, the sense of defeat contributed to widespread political and ideological reflection. Questions of leadership, military preparedness, and regional unity became central themes in public discourse. The war was not interpreted solely as a military event, but as a turning point that demanded broader reassessment of political direction and strategy. Internationally, the war's aftermath prompted urgent diplomatic engagement. The scale of territorial change and the presence of displaced populations created immediate pressure for a negotiated framework to address borders, security arrangements, and political rights. Efforts at the United Nations and among major global powers focused on establishing principles for a post-war settlement, emphasizing the need for withdrawal from occupied territories and recognition of secure and acknowledged boundaries. One of the key outcomes of this diplomatic process was the emergence of a framework that sought to address both territorial and political dimensions of the conflict. The principles articulated in subsequent international discussions emphasize the inadmissibility of territorial acquisition by war and the need for peaceful resolution of disputes. These ideas would become central to future negotiations and diplomatic efforts in the region. Yet despite these initiatives, the underlying issues that had contributed to the war were not resolved. Territorial occupation, refugee displacement, security concerns, and competing national narratives remained deeply embedded in the political landscape. The war had altered the structure of the conflict, but it had not eliminated its causes. In the months and years following the ceasefire, the Middle East entered a new phase characterized by both heightened tension and renewed diplomatic activity. Military control over territories became a central issue in international relations, while internal political dynamics within affected states continued to evolve in response to the war's outcomes. The human dimension of the aftermath remained particularly significant. Families displaced or affected by the conflict faced uncertain futures, while communities adjusted to new political realities. The war had ended quickly, but its consequences unfolded slowly, shaping patterns of life, governance, and identity across multiple societies. Ultimately, the aftermath of the Six-Day War revealed a central paradox. A conflict that lasted only 6 days had produced consequences that would extend for decades. The rapidity of the war's conclusion stood in contrast to the enduring complexity of its legacy, ensuring that its impact would remain a defining feature of Middle Eastern history long after the guns had fallen silent. The end of the Six-Day War did not mark the end of its story. it marked instead the beginning of a longer historical arc, one in which the consequences of 6 days of fighting would continue to unfold across politics, borders, societies, and collective memory for decades. The war's brevity stood in striking contrast to its depth of impact. In less than a week, a regional order that had taken nearly 2 decades to stabilize after 1948 was fundamentally altered. What made the war historically distinct was not only its speed, but the completeness of its transformation. Military outcomes translated almost immediately into territorial change, and territorial change translated into political and psychological disruption across multiple states. Israel emerged from the conflict in control of territories that dramatically expanded its strategic depth and reshaped its security environment. Yet this expansion also introduced a new and enduring set of challenges: governance over diverse populations, questions of legitimacy, and the long-term implications of military occupation. For Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, the war represented a profound rupture in strategic assumptions. Military doctrines that had been built on expectations of deterrence, coordination, or parity were exposed as inadequate under the conditions of rapid, multi-front warfare. The speed of defeat forced an urgent reassessment not only of military preparedness, but also of political direction and regional alignment. Leadership across the Arab world confronted the need to reinterpret both the causes and consequences of the conflict in ways that could restore stability and credibility. Yet the impact of the war extended beyond governments and military institutions. It reshaped the lived experience of entire populations. In the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, Sinai, and the Golan Heights, communities found themselves under new administrative realities almost overnight. Borders that had once functioned as lines of separation became zones of occupation, regulation, and negotiation. The human consequences of these shifts unfolded gradually but persistently, influencing movement, identity, and daily life. At the international level, the war also marked a turning point in diplomatic engagement with the Middle East. The scale of territorial change and the emergence of unresolved occupation issues placed renewed emphasis on the need for negotiated settlement frameworks. The principles that emerged in the aftermath centered on withdrawal, recognition, and security guarantees became foundational to subsequent diplomatic efforts, even as their implementation remained contested and incomplete. One of the most enduring features of the war's legacy was the way it redefined the concept of security in the region. For Israel, the territorial gains of 1967 altered the strategic map in ways that reduced immediate vulnerability, but introduced longer-term political complexity. For neighboring Arab states, the experience of rapid military defeat led to new approaches to defense planning, alliance building, and internal political consolidation. Across the region, security was no longer understood solely in military terms, but as a broader condition shaped by political legitimacy, territorial control, and international engagement. The war also left a deep imprint on collective memory. In Israeli society, it was often remembered as a moment of existential relief and military achievement, yet also as the beginning of a more complicated political reality. In Arab societies, it became a defining moment of loss and reassessment, shaping political narratives, cultural expression, and ideological movements in the decades that followed. In both cases, the memory of the war extended beyond the battlefield, becoming part of broader discussions about identity, sovereignty, and historical trajectory. Despite the clarity with which the war ended militarily, it did not resolve the underlying tensions that had contributed to its outbreak. Issues of territory, displacement, recognition, and security remained deeply embedded in the political structure of the region. The rapid conclusion of hostilities did not produce closure. Instead, it created a new configuration of unresolved questions that would continue to influence diplomacy and conflict in subsequent years. In historical perspective, the Six-Day War stands as a moment in which acceleration replaced duration as the defining feature of conflict. Events that might once have unfolded over months or years were compressed into days, with consequences that extended far beyond their temporal limits. The war demonstrated how rapidly strategic assumptions could collapse under the pressure of miscalculation, perception, and decisive action. The significance lies not only in what was achieved or lost during those 6 days, but in what those 6 days set in motion. The transformation of borders, the reshaping of political expectations, and the emergence of new regional dynamics ensured that the war would not remain confined to its brief time frame. Instead, it became a foundational moment in the modern history of the Middle East, one whose echoes continue to shape the region's political and human landscape long after the final ceasefire was declared. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the people, civilizations, battles, myths, and moments that shaped our world. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire a future video. Until next time, keep exploring history, because the past is never truly gone.